which is good stuff. Well, welcome aboard. So what I have planned for you today, for us today, is to answer questions. So it's a Q&A. So as you think of questions about either content or about writing the DBQ, you can just go ahead and drop those into Ask a Question. Hanya, very nice to see you. And just put them in there because there may be more questions, especially as people start to move in from the other stream. And we have some Olympians among us, I suspect. Anybody repping an Olympic squad here today? I would imagine so. So we'll have some people. So please put the questions into Ask a Question as they come up. But then I have some material prepared on kind of a how to do the 2020 DBQ. And it includes some material that I've mentioned in my other streams. Some of you have been in my streams and that other Fiveable streamers have mentioned, of course, but it's kind of fresh too. So I have some ways that we might go ahead. There's some suggestions for students for how to attack that. And if you're here, maybe for Olympics purposes or some other thing, and you're not in AP World, but you're taking APUSH or AP Euro, the DBQ format and rubric, it's very similar. The prompts tend to be different in the different histories, but everything else is pretty similar. So we'll be able to check some of those things out. So let's do it. The Ottomans, Cam, I will tell you, I think a lot of world history books, and sometimes world history teachers overstate the role of Ottoman decline. And I'm just going to put that out there. You got a 600-year empire, right? And apparently like 2/3 of that was decline. It just doesn't check out to me. But we all make mistakes. So let's take a peek. I'm going to make myself littler. And then you also might take a look around at some of the things we have. There's a poll, which I will check in a moment. And so if you haven't done that yet, you can go ahead. On the old, like I said, we changed channels. On the old channel, I also had which element do you feel the least confident about? And it was like 95% sourcing. So I figured I didn't need to I love Mr. Little mentions Bram Hubble, who runs an excellent blog and a more occasional tweeter these days, but true legend and definitely one of my role model for me. So yes. Any case, if you take a look here, if you click on the big green button, it'll take you to some documents that we're going to use to practice with about part of the way through the stream. You can ask a question, take the poll, and then down below you see some resources. The AP World Study Guide is something that I put together with Amanda, Queen of Fiveable. So it has comprehensive resources you can look at for the whole course. Then I also have the link to the Ultimate Guide to the DBQ, which Mrs. Longnecker put together and is extraordinarily helpful. And she's here in the chat, so if you have a question about that, you can ask her. And then the link to the slides as we do. So let's take a little look here. So Think Fiveable, of course, are on the socials. I encourage you to check that out. I tweet early and I tweet often, so that's me, but I understand these other platforms, as I like to say, hold some value. Okay, let us take a look and just kind of get something going right away and look at one of the legendarily difficult things. Okay, if you have a question, you should put it in the box. And I would also point out that China did not fall apart. It still exists and is a very large country. So let's go ahead and take a look here at this. Now, this was a difficult document to use last year. And I like to use this with students for kind of two reasons. And the first reason to kind of practice with this document is that a lot of kids didn't use this document and got 5s on the exam. So the way the exam is set up, if there is a document that doesn't make any sense to you, you just skip it. You do not need to, especially this year. That advice is always good, and it's like 5 times as good this year. So you skip it. But secondly, this is a good example of how a picture, if you're looking at the image too much, it's not very helpful. But if you read the source line, it can be helpful. So let's take a look here. Then we look at the prompt. We're not going to do sourcing analysis on this, but we're just going to think about how we might use this one as evidence. So the question is asking, how did the Portuguese transform maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century? So this box comes from the very end of that time period. So we have that. No, opium trade's much later, Cam. That's not going to help you here. You take a look at this, and you see, like, what does this tell us about Portugal and the Indian Ocean trade? If you only look at the source line and then you look at the prompt. Yeah. Right. Thank you, Annika. Right. It tells us, so who's they, Arosa? Yeah, and Sana. We have these things, right? Yes, Portugal. So it tells us the fact that this box was being designed for export to Portugal tells us that they're a significant player. Now, in some ways, that's a change, right? Because Gujarats in India, right? It tells you. Artisans were not making things specifically for the Portuguese before 1500, and they were in 1600. So that's those change. But it also shows continuity because Gujarati artisans were making things for export like before 1500 and after 1600. So you can kind of see it either way. So we're taking a look at this. So it's a way. Now, if you get too down in the details of this, you're like, why is there a tiger? It's like, well, I don't know. But you can get a lot from looking at the source, and probably because the tiger represented a different place, and so it made it more foreign and exotic and interesting in Portugal. So this is just a little way we can do that. Okay. So I'll layer in the questions, because really answering your questions is the most important thing in a Q&A, and I don't want to get going too much without answering your questions, and then we'll layer in the practice. Okay. So if you have any questions right now, you can put them in. I'll take a look and see what is in Ask a Question right now. All right. So here we are. Okay, so the first question that we have here is from Jason, who's asking, what are the significant impacts of the Opium Wars? And there's 2 Opium Wars, although or 3, Mr. Little, Mrs. Longnecker might be able to help me out there. You would not have to know the details of them. Saying Opium War or Opium Wars would count as evidence for when you're answering the question. So this is really the point where, after the first Opium War, where it's clear that China is less of a world power and that European imperialism is more important. So that's sort of the big takeaway. So this would be in the early 1800s, which will be in the third time period after 1800. So like in that last time period there. But then there's also the significant things is that the treaty allows Britain, at the end of that war, allowed Britain to import opium, which the Chinese had wanted to make illegal because it's addictive and bad for you. You have that, and then they were allowed to do that, and so that became a big part of the growth of early capitalism, was the British East India Company coercing Indian peasants into growing opium in the Ganges Valley, and then selling it there, and then profiting a lot by selling tea and opium, different spots. So you have that. Then secondly, Britain was also given preferential status, so you get those unequal treaties that gave Britain a lot of influence in China that come out of this. So China doesn't all the way fall apart, but it certainly does lose full control over its territory. So it's one of those things you don't want to overstate, but it still is true that China lost full control. The Chinese state lost full control over its territory. And the Opium War is a big part of that. Okay, great. Then we have a question here. Does the outside evidence have to be within the time period of the prompt? That's a really interesting question from Nimai. And I apologize if I don't pronounce that correctly. So the short answer to the question is no, but you're probably better off doing that. What's the most important thing with outside evidence is that you explain how it supports an argument. So you explain how it supports an argument. We'll talk about that some when I get into my little prepared spiel. But the idea is you should be able to identify something like, say, the Opium Wars that we just did. And, yep, capitalize them, Opium Wars. And then you say, this shows that, or these show that, or these are, you can even just say it, these are evidence that Britain was a major power because they were able to exert this kind of control over some aspects of Chinese policy, the Chinese government. So the most important thing is you explain how it relates. I would say if you're using something from outside the time period, that you're all right as long as you make it clear to the reader that you know you're outside the time period. So like, let's say you're doing something from later, which of course could happen this year because a lot of you probably studied 20th century events and that's not directly tested. But like in Mr. Little's stream yesterday, when he was talking about globalization as a past and further past and present kind of a thing, as long as you say like in a later time period, this happens, and that shows how this worked in the time period of the prompt because, and then you explain how it shows that relationship. That can in fact actually be complex. And so if you're using more outside evidence than you need, and some of it's from outside the time period, that would contribute to complexity. So just to really echo the comment in the chat from Mrs. Longnecker, and that is the because it's really important. Okay, so now we have one more question here that I'll do before we take a look at the other things, and then just load them in there. Okay, so it says, this is from Sarah, if there were events or treaties within another event, would they be considered a separate piece of outside evidence? For example, the Meiji Restoration and the Meiji Civil Code, would this be considered one or two pieces of evidence? That's going to be considered one piece of evidence. And this is something that has changed somewhat. Maybe from, and your teachers may or may not be aware of this. It used to be like if they used to require more outside evidence, but the scoring standards were more lenient in how it was counted. So sometimes students would rattle off a string of trade goods, like for a trade question. So you might have an Indian Ocean trade question, and a student would go like pepper, gold, ivory, cotton textiles. And that would count as 4 pieces of evidence. That's not really true anymore. That's all kind of one piece of evidence that's used to support the point. But as we see, like in this year's rubric, you only need 2, and you can get a point for each one. So the short answer to Sarah's question is those are probably going to be considered one piece of evidence. Again, the key will be how do you explain it. If you explain how each of those pieces, even though they're similar, support the argument in a different way, well, then that's something. But in general, you should consider those to be one piece of evidence. Great. All right, feel free to keep loading questions in there. I'm going to go through my little how-to on the modified DBQ, and then we will I'll field some more. All right. Hello, Dan. Good to see you. Drop a question in there. So these are the basics. Now, some people are real familiar with this, but others are probably just getting rolling with their starting. So either way is fine if you're just dropping in to this and doing some learning here. So we'll have these. This will be your situation. I don't doubt that. Now, you might wonder about this part, and I've made this little joke before, but I'm actually going to refine it. So we have 2 things here that are working at cross purposes. Right. And I made this joke before. It's not super original. I know this is a well-traveled meme. But since then, I've looked more closely at the rubric and looked more closely at some of the things that students observed and the materials that the College Board are giving out. And what I have for you is bad news and good news. Okay. Now, on the overall point, Tanya in the chat has it exactly right that there's not enough time to look at your notes. So you would only write exactly I agree with you that that is good news, Tanya. It's just you and your brain. So you just roll. So you want to hear the good news? Yeah, you'll like it. So the bad news is they've given you a task that is impossible. And this is always somewhat true with DBQ testing because they want to create a normal distribution of scores, which means they want it to be a bell-shaped curve, where most of the scores, and they don't want that bell shape over 50% either, because they set the scoring always so it's like 1/3 of the raw score of the DBQ is the median. That's what they do. Now, I don't know why, but that's what they do. I'm not a statistician. We have that appropriate yesterday. I'm just do. How do you mean? Oh, may the 4th be with you. Right on. Sorry, a little slow. Okay, so you have that. So they're always creating a task that's very difficult so that it creates that distribution of scores. But this year, because of the at-home quality, they literally want to punish people who try to cheat. So if you're spending time looking for the answer, that's going to take away from your ability to do the question. So what's the good news then? Well, the good news is that nobody is going to get, or very, very, very few people are going to get a 10 out of 10 on the rubric because it's not designed for that to be possible. And so even though it's, even though you have a couple less documents, you have some more tasks to do because they're looking for another piece of outside evidence. But so here's what this means, though. Here is the good news. The good news is you should focus on the things you do well. Now, like Mrs. Longnecker advises, I agree. You should try to do all the things, but you should know that you will not have to do. It's not designed for you to have to do them all perfectly in order to get the highest score. So we don't know. I can't answer any questions about what raw score is going to lead to what AP exam score, but we do know. I can say with certainty, it will not require a 10 to get a 5, and it probably won't require a 9 to get a 5. And so the good news in this is that you avoid the trap by just doing your job on the essay, and you start with the parts of that. You start with the parts of the rubric, the parts of the task that you feel the best about. Okay. And you don't want to have really all your notes there anyways. You'll spend a lot of time looking through them. So I recommend having a few charts there. And then when you see what time frame the topic is, throwing away the ones that don't fit. But even then, you're just kind of glancing at them. You mostly want to be looking at the document. Yeah, I think a pieces chart, Ava, is a good way to go. And if you have a pieces chart for each of the time periods, I'm actually going to, I'm going to change my screen here and kind of show you what you might do instead. Hi, now I'm big. I'll show you something here. This is actually in tonight's stream. So those of you who aren't crammers are getting a little tiny bit of free cram content. So pieces could be spice tea or inspect or something like that. So this might be an example of what, there's no real best way to do that, that acronym, whatever you have. Yeah, spice tea. Right. And this is one that's overall, and really you don't want to put too many things in here because you can only use, you're only using 2 pieces of outside evidence, maybe some other stuff for context. Okay. So you might have one of these for each time period, and then you could quiz yourself. You could give, let's say you have a younger sibling who can read but is really happy to wants to help you do well on the AP test. So you give them your 3 different pieces, spice tea, inspect charts, and then you have them say something from there, and then you guess, and then you say which time period it is. So you want to take the things you already know and be able to use them well. So it's a trap, but you do not need to fall into the trap. And the fact that other kids will, means that you'll have an advantage if you don't. Okay, so here we go. So here's what we'll be doing. with this. So I have those 4 points in the poll. So if you haven't taken the poll, if you could take a look at that. And it's like the other DBQ, if you've done those in your class, and I know not everybody has, but if you have, it'd be a little bit different. And as you can see, the bold are the changes, and there's more points for evidence and more possible points for sourcing analysis. So that's where the change is. So those are the skills that will most reward your improvement. This is my advice for what to do with the, on game day. So you get the, go make this bigger. Okay. So you get the document, and you got your stuff. You got a couple charts. You've got, you're looking at the document. You're kind of freaking out. So what do? I think the most important thing is that you take a few notes, like not too many. But just a few notes while you're going through the document. While you're going through the documents. And so just at the top of the paper, you have a little bit like a summary, like 5 words, 4 words, what the prompt means. Yeah, Wikipedia, that is a trap, Jason. That is a real trap. Because by all the time you spend looking at that stuff is time you're not doing the other things that earn points. But you could, like if something's really bugging, you could look it up. What you want to do is you want to read the note, you want to read the documents closely. So you want to do that. And then secondly, you want to figure out how they might reflect on the prompt itself. So you want to take for each one, you want to write just a couple words. And normally I advise kids to do this on the actual documents, but you could just do it on a notepad or in a separate tab. So like document 1, like how does it help you with the prompt? Document 2, how does it help you with the prompt? What does it suggest about the prompt? Because that's going to help you organize your response. And then a note or two about sourcing. So if you've used HIP or HAP or CAP or HAPPY or HIPPO, whichever one of those kind of things you're using, you might just make a note about what is going on there. Like you might just write author or document type or whatever it is, letter. It's a letter. So that's just like a little note to yourself so that when you're writing, the O doesn't really mean anything. It's just funner to say HIPPO than HIP. Or it could be, oh, why is this important? But really, it's just HIP. So I'm not trying to confuse you. All right, good. And then don't get stuck. So as we're going to see, I really strongly recommend that people focus on 2 or 3 of the documents, and then go on to a 4th and 5th document after you've done outside evidence, or if you get stuck on outside evidence. So you don't want to, that you could do, what you don't want to do is wind up spending too much time in a document. You absolutely don't have to use all 5 documents. And if you're not going to write every single bit of the rubric because you're going to run out of time, you're better off focusing on 2. And so if a document is not clear or you don't understand how to use it, you're not even sure what it's saying, just skip it. There's one document in the practice one that I have that's sort of purposefully or I left it in after I changed it. It's quite hard to use. So like if you're going through there, you're like, I wouldn't know what to do with this. Well, what you would do with it is you would skip it. Okay. So that's all pretty general advice. Here's my specific advice. And after you take your notes, I would encourage you to draft, or at least to try drafting your essay in a different order than you're going to write it. Okay. So you want to write the response starting with a thesis and context at the top and then going through your evidence and then restating your thesis at the end. That's the best way to write it. But I recommend that you draft it in another way. And in fact, I just put up a practice prompt in our practice community to encourage students to play around with that process. So using up to 6 pieces of evidence, that'd be 4 documents and 2 from the outside, you want to think about how do they fit together in body paragraphs. So to help with things like sourcing and possibly with complexity, you want to link your evidence together in chains. And so you might have 2 or 3 components to your response. You might say, that something was true for 2 main reasons. So then that naturally translates into 2 body paragraphs. So after you've taken your notes on going going through the documents, really brief notes on how they can help you support the document. Then go ahead and draft it. Like which ones are going to go together. You can just write down the numbers like 1, 2, and then like a piece of outside evidence, like Sarah said, Meiji. So you just say like 1, 2, 5, Meiji. That's going to be one of your body paragraphs. Then another body paragraph might be 3 plus some other thing. Opium Wars, an example we've talked about. So there you are. So that's, well, 3 documents and 2 pieces of evidence. Just start writing then, so that you can get through those things and do the sourcing and all that. After you've come up with your body paragraphs, then you can use that to generate your thesis. There's a couple reasons for doing this. You'll wind up with a more complex thesis probably because you'll have incorporated the other things. Your thesis will more naturally fit with your arguments. And finally, I found that a lot of students sometimes, and I don't know if some of you have probably had this experience, you can let us know if you have, where you go to start and you're just not sure where to start. Like, where do I start? You can't think of the thesis you want. It's hard to incorporate all the documents into your brain. About. The topic's not something you know about, so you're not sure what to do. Okay, well, you can just start writing about the body paragraphs. You can just start writing about the documents. You can say one way. I mean, that's a good friend of yours, and like just getting to start writing is one way. One way that this affected that, one way that things changed, one way that things just stayed the same. And then, for example, and then write about a document and then connect them together. Now, if you want to say something a little more sophisticated, that's great. You can always put that at the end of the body paragraph. So my first tip is to not get stuck. My second tip is to design your body paragraphs and then think about your thesis. Unless a thesis comes to you right away, then do your thesis. But then when you write it, reverse that, do thesis context, then body paragraphs. Cool. All right. The key to doing this is all the parts of the rubric are asking you to identify and explain. So this is my third big tip, is to always be explaining, like an Abe, right? So you have to identify and explain. So for the thesis, you're identifying how much. The prompts are almost always in a evaluate the extent to which, or develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which, or evaluate, which is basically asking how much. So in the practice DBQ that I have there, if you haven't hit the big green button, I would really encourage you to do that. And you see, you could say, it's basically crying out for an adverb. Like, what's the prompt plus a modifier? So early modern rulers mostly used traditional methods, or early modern readers used some traditional methods, but also included innovative ideas. That would be identifying your argument. And then you have to explain it. So you have to have both parts. But all parts of the rubric are like this, where you're identifying, like, what are you saying? And then you're explaining it. So context is the same thing, where you're identifying a broader development relevant to the prompt, and then you're explaining how it relates to the prompt. So you're always identifying and explaining. Evidence we've talked about already. You're identifying what it is and explaining how it supports a claim. So with the document, you're explaining what it's saying or what part of it's saying. You don't have to use the whole document, just a piece of it. And for outside evidence, you're explaining what happened. So in the Opium Wars, the British defeated the Chinese military, and then you're explaining what that shows us. And then finally, with sourcing, it's the same kind of thing, where you want to think about first identifying an element of the sourcing, and then the hard part is figuring out how does that influence the document or your argument. Then you want to explain that. So you want to identify something, the sourcing, and we'll practice that especially. All right. The next slide is a giant blue, fiveable blue question mark, the same color as Tan Ho, fiveable leader for all of us, same as his cake mixer. That's how on brand he is. Okay, so let's get some questions in there about any topic, any history topic, or anything with writing the essay. Okay, I'm going to take a peek here to ask a question. and see what is going on in recent years. Oh, yeah. All right, Shane has a good question, although you're probably unlikely to see one of these, but it is a skill that is useful on like some of the short answer questions. And many of you will probably take AP US History next year, and so this will be helpful. So the question that Shane asked is, what is the best way to source a document that was published in recent years, like a document published in 2015 talking about the self-strengthening movement? Well, you first of all want to kind of figure out when was it written, because something published in 2015 could have been written like in the 1890s. So there's that. So it's really when it's written. But it's really a little bit like sourcing anything else. In that you want to look at who wrote it. So it'll often be a person with some sort of academic qualifications. You know, they could be a historian, or it might be a sociologist or a political scientist, and those people would see things a little differently. You would also think about what's happening now. So that would be really big trends. Like Mr. Little's review of globalization yesterday, this has come up in some of the recent secondary source evaluation questions, where people today might be more interested in things like cultural diffusion and syncretism, because we see so much of it in our global world today, you know, where there's this, you know, similarities and differences of global culture, like we've talked about in some of the other streams. Like there's McDonald's in India, but they serve different foods, or in some cases, I learned recently, serve ice cream, or mainly ice cream, right? Or you have, so that's something that's similar and different. And so then we can, of course, see that in the past, like that box that was made in Gujarat to send to Portugal, incorporated traditional Indian things, but it was also designed to appeal to Portuguese consumers. So if you were to get something like that, you'd want to think about what are the big trends like right now. And I would say, you know, we're after the Cold War, because sometimes you'll get ones that are from the 90s, and then it's kind of looking at the end of the Cold War, but also just the increases in globalization. And that's one of the things that, you know, our very, very current situation can help us with the COVID-19 spread being so much a product of globalization. And how that connects things. So then I would say like end of the Cold War, globalization, interest in human rights. You want to think, what are the big things now? Or it could be with China, as your example that Shane has here. It would also be possible that you're looking at what the rise of China as a power in the, you know, in the 21st century. So like the new edition of some like world history books might emphasize certain things about China more because there's more interest in that with China as a resurgent power. Okay, and always let me know if that didn't answer your question. All right. Ooh, I would love to talk about the Cossack Rebellion. So Annika asks about the Cossack Rebellion, and there's also different Cossack rebellions. So the word Cossack and Cossack communities kind of changes a little bit over time. So in the early modern period, so 1450 to 1750, when there'd be some Cossack rebellions, there's also a really big one in the late 1700s. So Cossacks were autonomous, meaning independent communities that were at the edge of the Russian Empire. And so some serfs could escape. It was tough to escape being a serf, but if you did, you got into a Cossack community, that could happen. The word Cossack is related to the word Kazakh, which is a Central Asian group, but Cossack itself does not really have an ethnic meaning to it, because there would have been people coming from different cultures, and then the Cossacks would have kind of formed their own culture, which I guess we could think of as syncretic. So Cossacks were free people. They're not serfs. They're also not nobility. And they lived at the edges of the Russian Empire in the Eurasian steppe. And they were often like in semi-formal or formal agreements with the Russian Empire, the Russian czars, and they kind of patrolled the frontiers and were sort of auxiliary military forces. And then in exchange for that, they were able to maintain their independence. But as you can imagine, a community of people founded based on their freedom is occasionally going to have some grievances about how free they are. They're going to want a better deal or more access to certain trading centers, or fewer or they want fewer restrictions. So occasionally they'll rebel against the Tsar, and so the biggest one in the early modern period is in 1670-ish. A guy named Stepan Razin, or Stenka Razin, is a Cossack, and he leads like this waterborne group of rebels up the Volga River from the Caspian Sea. So they're like right in the center of Eurasia, and they attack some Russian strongholds in places that Russia had only recently annexed. And so some other serfs might join this because they might want to be free, and people might have some other kind of grievances. Okay, that's a lot of words for Annika's question. So what's the significance of this? Well, it's as the Russian state expanded, it had this kind of complicated relationship with some of the other people in those territories, and sometimes those people push back, and they're like, no, you can't turn this into land with serfs because we live here. And then the Tsars would be like, no, we want to do that. And they're like, no, you can't. So you could think of it like other rebellions or pushback on the edges of empires. Like in New Mexico, you could compare this like to the Pueblo revolt in some way. Now, the Pueblo communities in what's today New Mexico weren't nomadic like the Cossacks were, but they were at the edge of the Spanish Empire. And so they rebelled, and they didn't want, they're trying to push the Spanish Empire back. Or you could also compare it a little bit to Queen Nzinga in what's today Angola and negotiating with the Portuguese, like that. So you think of this as a group of people who's trying to maintain their freedom at the edge of an expanding empire. Now you get into the 19th century, and Cossacks go like full-on apparatus for the Russian state, and they become like auxiliary forces and are involved in a lot of military actions and some atrocities. But so that's for the early modern, before like 1800 period. Okay. All right. Arosa asks, what's the difference between describe and analyze? So we could take a look. I don't know if this is going to come up as much in these prompts, because you'll kind of get this evaluate the extent to which kind of thing. But analyze means like literally breaking something apart. Like analytic chemistry is about the parts of molecules and stuff. And I'm at the very edge of my chemistry knowledge right now with that sentence. So no chemistry questions. It's not 1984 anymore. But you're breaking things apart. So what are the parts? So cause and effect, or when you're looking at the documents and you're putting them into like buckets. I know some people use that bucket system where you're putting them into, you're creating your body paragraphs. That's analysis. Okay. So description is more like narration, like this happened, then that happened. So a main idea with details. So a description would be like just explain, not so much explaining, but just talking about what happened with detail. Whereas analysis will be a little higher level, where you're looking at the relationships between things, similarities, differences, causes, effects, continuities, and changes. So we'll be analyzing, and you can run into trouble in the DBQ when you start doing too much describing, because then you're not analyzing. All right, Varun asks, when sourcing, would it be okay if your sourcing slightly weakens your overall argument? No, that is like, it depends. As long as you acknowledge it. And if you do, that's complexity, because all these documents don't point in the same direction. Sometimes kids will ask about complexity. Should I have like a counterclaim in my thesis to set up complexity? And it's like, well, sure, because the documents probably don't all point in one direction. They're not going to be set up that way. But what's more important than doing that is that when you're looking at the documents themselves or the outside evidence combined with the documents, that you're looking at how those things are complex. And this is what Varun is getting at here, I think. And that is, so you're analyzing the source and you're like, oh, wait, this might not say exactly what it says. And so then you acknowledge that. Okay. Then you acknowledge that. So then you're not so much weakening your overall argument, but you're making a more complex argument. All right. So what do you do if you start off with a thesis that's like pretty straightforward, and then while you're analyzing the documents and doing the sourcing, you're like, oh, wow, this is a lot more complicated than I thought like 25 minutes ago. Well, that's where your second thesis comes in, because the reader knows that this is an on-demand essay, and you've only been thinking about these things for And you've only been thinking about these things for a few minutes. I mean, literally, you might get a topic that you don't know much about. And actually, let me just tell you something. That's not bad, because then whatever you remember from your textbook isn't interfering with analyzing the documents, and you're just like on it. So you're not expected to be an expert here. And so by the time you get to the end, you might be like, hey, okay, so this is a little more complicated kind of a deal. It's not all traditional methods. Some people say they're using traditional methods, but they're actually innovating inside of them. That would be complexity. So I encourage you to do that, Varun, and then just own it. Okay, so we have a couple more questions here. All right. So it looks like Mrs. Longnecker answered one of these questions well on the primary secondary source. Yeah, there's a King Dan. Click the big green button. There's a sample DBQ right there. Oh, a sample written one. Oh, right. That's what I do kind of in those streams. Okay. Once you go ahead, so some of these are, the College Board has them publicly posted, but we're not going to put them in streams. But if you email me, I can direct you how to get there. Okay. About that, and you look, you go into the apcentral.collegeboard.org, and then you find the courses and exams, find the exam, and you have to, it's a lot of clicks, but you want to find the sample responses. You'll be able to find it. All right, last question here, and then we're going to practice a little bit. And this question here is from Ava, and Ava asked, will they always ask the extent, or could it just be evaluate? It will always, I guess I would never say for always here. I would think, given the stressful nature of this year's exams with the take it home and the shorter time and everything, that they'll follow a fairly familiar format. So evaluate the extent to which, but it will be asking you to do that. So evaluate will be asking you how much of something. And let me explain to you why that is, because it makes the prompt wordier, but it's actually good news. So the bad news is it makes the prompt wordier. The good news is you only have to do one thing in your essay. So if it said, compare two things, well, then you might need to identify similarities and differences to do that well. But if it says evaluate the extent to which this and that were similar, then you could only do similarities by saying they're very similar, or you could only do differences by saying they're not similar at all, or you could do some kind of a mix. So that evaluate the extent to which is meant to only have one requirement for the student's thesis in the prompt, so that kids don't put together a good thesis that doesn't cover all the parts of the prompt. So here there's only one part of the prompt. You just have to identify your answer, probably an adverb, and then you have to explain why that's true in 1 or 2 sentences, or maybe 3, but really you should be able to do it in 1 or 2. And if it gets into 3, do not worry, but that would be the deal. Okay. I see questions are continuing to come in. I'm going to have one more big question mark at the end, and then we'll kind of take a peek. So let's take a look here at what does sourcing. So here is sourcing, which is, for a lot of students, it's the most difficult thing. So you should just know that. What that does mean, though, the good news there, the bad news is it's hard. The good news is that if you can do it, it'll set you apart from other students. And this thing is basically curved, even though they say it's not. So doing things well that are harder for other students will help you. So this is what it means. So I've got that there, right? I got to tell you, I love the song that goes with this product. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. This will be a little bit more interactive. I'm going to create a new poll question. So why don't you go ahead. So here's the prompt from the practice DBQ, and this is the first document. So you can take a look at that, but you can just look at what's on the screen right now. Because students are successful at the test exam, one of the things they consistently report is that they look at the sourcing line more intently than at the stuff in the source itself. That's like a universal thing. So want you to take a look, though, and see which part of that sourcing do you think would be the easiest to do. I'm going to create a poll, then we can vote on it and kind of see. You might have done the P's in different order. I feel like I do that every time. Okay, so just go ahead and take a look at that, and please go ahead and vote in the poll and see which one, if you were looking at this, which of these elements would you want to use in order to analyze the sourcing of the document. And sometimes they fuzz together a little bit. I mean, there's not clear distinctions between these things all the time. So people could just go on in there. Okay. So yeah. Have that. And I'm actually going to answer Rosa's question here. Rosa, because it's really relevant to this. Rosa asks, can you use, for example, POV twice in the same body paragraph or entire DBQ? For sure. I mean, some kids find that one or two of these things are easier for them to do than others, and they just ride those. That's fine. This is not meant to show how well-rounded you are with these skills. It's meant to show, can you do the skills at like a, what would be a basic college level. And so if you're doing sourcing analysis a lot, that is great, even if you're using the same element as you go through. Okay? Because now sometimes it'll be dependent on the document. So let's see, what if people said here in the poll, it looks like a lot of people here are saying some combination of, it's like intended audience, point of view. So intended audience would be that he's writing to a friend. So what impact do people think that, for people who went intended audience, if you could just drop in the chat, what impact do you think intended audience will have on the document? Like, how will that, and you only have to do one of them. So different kids could score the sourcing point using completely different ideas with the exact same document. It happens all the time. Okay. To or from, yeah, it might be, right? Okay, right. Got some good things coming in here. Right. Now, so maybe then you could say, and this is the kind of sourcing analysis that wouldn't contribute to complexity, but would probably earn the sourcing point. And that would be to say, since he's writing to a friend, he's probably being honest in his appraisal of the Ottoman Empire. And people have different things. Yeah, we have that. And other people are saying some of the candor, that would work great. It's a nice word. So you could do that. Now that's not going to, that could work. And you could do that like inside of a sentence. So it would just be like, just between a couple of commas. Okay, how about point of view? So his point of view is he's from Europe. That name's actually Flemish, which is today Belgium, like Flanders. But he's representing the Central European kings, and he is in the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. So how would that, if people who went that route, how is that going to affect what he has to say here, do you think? Being the ambassador. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the document here. Right? Now, why would he praise the Ottoman Empire if he's the ambassador? All right. He could be, as a European politician. We don't know what his motivation is in writing back to his friend. It really kind of depends. Yeah, he does. But this is he wants to maintain good relations, but this is a private letter, so he's probably more free to say what he's thinking. Okay. Now, if you haven't read this document already, you can look at it probably later. But he kind of lays out in here, in this part of the letter, I excerpted a few things. First of all, he's very impressed by the size of the Sultan's military, which might suggest that the Ottoman Empire has a bigger military than where he's from. So you might say something like, since he's from somewhere else and seems so impressed by the size of the military, we can infer that the Ottoman Empire had a much bigger military than these other places. Otherwise, he'd be like, hey, you know, it's a big. Otherwise, he'd be like, oh, they just have a military, right? And I think what Tanya's saying, he's analyzing the empire. That comes from his position as an ambassador. He's not there to praise. His job is to provide accurate information to his employer. So he's going to be providing, what he sees and kind of breaking it down. So he says it's really big. He also says that it seems well planned out and organized, and the Turks promote people based on ability, not who they're connected to. And so in this way, he's kind of criticizing his own country, like kind of backhandedly. If you read the rest of the letter, it's more clear. Okay. So you could say as an outsider, he is interested in like the facts of it. And the fact that he is surprised indicates that this is probably a bigger deal. That's how you could use it towards your argument. All right. Now, the historical situation, which you might not be aware of because it's more detailed than you might get in this period. No, this is during Suleiman's reign, King Dan. And during Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire was at its peak. So that's the historical situation. But if you didn't know that, that's okay. Like if you had either point of view or purpose audience ideas, those are just fine. You might have known that during this time, the Ottomans are advancing into Central Europe. And so he might be a little freaked out since he's representing someone in Central Europe, seeing this giant military on the move. All right, let's do it again. All right. I wonder if I wish you could duplicate polls in this system. All right. Wipes them out. Oh. Okay, I'm going to create a new poll. You go ahead and read the source, and you think of what you might want. This will be for document 2. And this is a picture, and again, you can look at it there if you want. Which of those things do you think will be which of these things will be most useful in determining this? Yeah. You can't, the things are all in different boxes, unfortunately, Tanya. That's all right. I'll get it. I'll give you a second to read it. Okay. Created the poll. So go on in and think here. So the historical situation. Now, at this one, the document is not it's the historical situation for the creation of the document, not for the event itself. And so the historical situation and the creation of the document is the reign of Akbar. So you might think, how is that going to affect the way that this document, so this is an illustration, it's a picture. How will that affect the way the picture appears? The fact that it's being done during the reign of Akbar. And so you have to know a little something about the historical situation here. And if you didn't, then you might won't let you vote. Oh, is that because you already voted there? Yeah, my bad. Okay. Well, what do people think? You can just drop it in the chat there. No, that's my fault. Or not my fault. What do you think? What would you look for here? So the point of view of this, like that's going to be who's making it. So if you say point of view, say who do you think is making it? If you say intended, who do you think it's intended for? Like what do you think this thing is supposed to be doing, this book? So why are they reprinting Babur's autobiography, right? For Akbar. Yeah. Yeah. So he's already written it, and then why are they, praising him? So that if they're going to be reprint, what would be the reason for that, Sarah? Why would they be praising Akbar? Why would in Akbar's reign, would there be this praise for his grandfather? Okay, right. Yep. The pride of the empire, right? So this is, now we're thinking about things like legitimacy. That's an important word here. It's go ahead and take a look at the thing itself. So Akbar, as you might know, what's the Ottoman Empire? And again, if you didn't know the historical situation with this, like if you see those names Babur and Akbar and you're like, I don't know who those people are, guess what? You can still get a 5 on the AP World Test. You don't have to know everything. But if you did know about this, because a lot of kids know some things about the Mughals, and you might know that Babur is the first Mughal emperor, and then his grandson Akbar, when he's emperor, you know, the Mughal Empire is a super happened in place. And so they're trying to show the legitimacy maybe of their rule by, you know, connecting Akbar with his grandfather, saying, you know, we have this really. So then the historical situation would be that this is being done at the height or maybe the peak or one of the high points of the Mughal Empire. Intended audience is probably the literate public. People who are going to read it, so they're trying to impress those people. Right? Then as a result, now this battle was a victory for the Mughals, and how does it look? Does it look like does it look like they won the battle? Yeah, it looks pretty, right? It's not all messy. There's not a bunch of dead bodies on their side. So what's kind of happening here is, you might say, because they're trying to impress the readers with the power of the empire in order to, you know, give it legitimacy, it's showing, you know, the Akbar's grandfather as successful. So it's kind of saying, you know, we've inherited that. Yeah. And so it's not so much, yeah, Sarah says exaggerated, and it's not so much that that's not true. Like, you know, the Mughals did win the Battle of Panipat, and defeated the Delhi Sultanate, established the Mughal Empire, and all that. But it might, you know, overemphasize, exaggerate, you know, those features. I'm sure there were Babur, I'm sure, lost people in the course of this war with the Delhi Sultanate, and it probably wasn't this clean and everything. So it's not so much that it's false, but yeah, maybe like that. Panipat, that's what you think, Tanya? I know that you know a little Hindi, so that might help. Thank you. Help me. Yeah, you could say the intended, you know, it might be one of those things like sometimes happens in dysfunctional situations where people talk about the leader and it's just like an audience of one, really. Like we might all be watching it on the TV, but the person speaking is only talking to one person. So it might be meant to like buck up Akbar, and then everybody else is just, you know, they're reprinting it. It's like, hey, look what your grandpa did. So maybe it's meant to be like, maybe the people who wrote this are like, come on, kid, you know, here's what you got to live up to. Now, this is a whole autobiography, and some of you might have even read parts of it. I know the new course and exam description suggests that. Okay, I had one more document ready to go, but I'm going to skip that because there's just a minute here, and I do want to see if there's any other. Thank you, Tanya. The pressure would, if you were Babur's grandson, I mean, the pressure would be real. And Akbar, I mean, you know, he seemed to live up to it. Okay, so here's the last source, and I'll just put that up here while I'm looking at the questions in case you wanted to ask about that and kind of see with this one, doing the source thing is actually going to help you answer the question, even if you don't read much of the document itself. So let me see if there's other questions here, though, that people would like me to answer. Yeah, I think I gave you an idea for the sample DBQ responses, right? No, all the questions are related, Luca. Just drop them and ask a question. It kind of gives you a thing to say, put it in ask a question. Okay, primary, secondary. Okay. So Sophia asks, how do you make your DBQ more argumentative? And what you do is you want to focus each body paragraph on how you're responding to the prompt. So at the simplest level for this prompt here, which is asking you to evaluate the extent to which rulers of early modern empires use traditional methods to consolidate power, then you would want to be focusing on something. You would want to be focusing on something that is a piece of that prompt. So you'd want to say something like, one way that modern empires use traditional methods to consolidate power was by, and then finish that thought. So what's something that maybe two documents have in common? Or one document and one piece of outside evidence. It'll be easier to do that if you're combining things together because that'll kind of force you to narrow it down. So with the first two documents we looked at, you might say that that's the picture and the Ottoman document. You could think of that as traditional or not traditional. So you could say one way that early modern leaders consolidated power was through the traditional method of amassing impressive military forces. And so that's a traditional method. So you make a reference to some past empire that had done that. And then you would explain how the documents show that. Now you could, with those, get a step more creative and be like, they're taking traditional means, big military, and combining innovation, gunpowder weapons. Okay, so you want to focus on your argument is going to be, to come back to Sophia's question in the shortest way possible, your argument is going to be one aspect of how you're answering the prompt. Okay, complexity. Now, complexity is exciting because history is complex. I'd say a couple things. Complexity is extremely rare, of course, as some people have heard me say, and I know Mr. Little's echoed this. When we graded DBQs, we're looking at like 0.1% of essays get complexity. So it's something that's fairly difficult. I would say that there are a couple of main ways, though, that it would happen. And the first way is something I mentioned already, and that is for each piece of evidence, looking at how the evidence could point in multiple directions. So you'd say, well, this could show that it's innovative, but it could also show tradition, like in this case. So it's kind of showing two different things. And that could either be different pieces of the document, or it could be how the document relates to another document. And this is something, there's a really good stream that Mrs. Longnecker did back in the fall on reasoning that includes complexity. And the big tip she gave is to use the documents to interpret each other. So if you're taking one document and saying, okay, it says this, but's going to be a big word with complexity because you're showing how it's complicated. But when you consider it along with this other document, well, that shows that it also means this. So it means a couple things. So in that like Portuguese in the Indian Ocean one, the prompt that I had up at the beginning with the box, simple answer to that prompt is Portuguese transformed the Indian Ocean because they like bully people into trading with them. But you could point out limits to that, like all along. You could say they're changing it, but it's limited in this way. And that limit could either be from something else like random fact that you happen to know about Indian Ocean trade, or a place where the Portuguese lost control of a fort or something. Or it could be something from another document. So this document says this, but that document says that. And instead of just saying on the one hand, on the other hand, like counterclaim style, you're explaining how it's complicated, how this is true, but it was limited. So that's one way to do it, using the documents together. The other way is just lots of sourcing, especially point of view sourcing, where you're showing how the way people viewed a situation was different based on who they were, or how situations were different based on or how the documents are different based on different historical situations. So again, in some ways it's simple. Like, what does complexity means? It means it's complicated, but you have to be kind of doing that throughout the essay in order to get that. Now, your thesis probably will be complex for an essay that gets the complexity point, but but just doing that's not enough. And sometimes kids will do that and they'll say, this was mostly true, but the other thing was also true, like a counterclaim, and then they'll have 2 paragraphs saying yes and 1 paragraph saying no. And that can work great for a lot of the points, but it won't earn the complexity point because you need to be showing how the components, like I'm doing this because like the subcomponents of your argument, you want to be showing how those are also complicated to do it. So last thing I'll say of that, I graded the DBQ on railroads that some of you might have done, railroads and empires, like how much did railroads contribute to empire building. So complex essays would point out, the few times I gave that point, would point out that railroad building contributed to empire building, but it also created the conditions for undoing the empire building. So in India, the British building railroads allowed them to control more of the country, but it also contributed to decolonization because it made a lot of people mad because they're forced to work on it and gave up their land. So it created direct resistance. But it also allowed the nationalist movement to move around the country and organize. Like Gandhi's on the train a lot, just as one small example. So complicated like that, but you're doing it within each document. Okay. All right. Any other questions that we could have there? Yeah. So Aros is asking, the idea is that your kind of counter claims are happening inside the body paragraphs. Or instead of having like one body paragraph that just says one thing and another body paragraph that just kind of says the opposite, you're sort of mixing them in another way. So with this prompt, you might have a body paragraph that's saying traditional methods with innovations. And then you might also have one that's saying like traditional methods purely applied. Yeah, within the document. Right, Sana. So you're just showing like the documents are complicated. You still want to sort your documents, Angeline, based on how you're going to look at the prompt. So you'd want to sort them sort of topically with that. Yeah, it could be parts of your thesis. So what topically, yeah, Persia's another, for kids in the chat, Persia's another spice tea pieces thing. That could be, but what I'm saying about your buckets or your Persia is you want to do something like a little more sophisticated than that. Like, so for example, if you said there are political reasons, there's like political traditions that people are extending, then you're going to need to say something more complex about it as you go through the evidence in that body paragraph. So it's really hard. But if it kind of comes to you, then you should just go with it. And somebody else asked about outside evidence. I mean, I think one of the ways to do outside evidence is like, as you're going through the documents, like, what do you think of? Like what's in that Ottoman document, there's one really prominent Ottoman example that a lot of people will use as evidence. And I purposely wound up cutting the document to keep that out. So the Ottoman document doesn't include the Janissaries, which is probably the most common piece of evidence for kids to use on an Ottoman topic. So as you're reading about the Ottomans, you're like, oh yeah, a lot of camels and stuff. Okay. And you're like, well, the Janissaries is why they were powerful. That's not in the document. So you can kind of think of that. And then you could point out, how are the Janissaries a little different? Or how are they similar? Like, how do they corroborate the claim in the document, or how do they complicate it? So if you're using your evidence with your other evidence, like mixing them together, that's the thing. So just keep thinking, just keep mixing. As I said before, always be explaining. All right. Well, we have lots of, I'm gonna cut it off there. People can be in touch with me. Some of you I'll see this evening. So if you're not a Cram Pass holder, you might consider that, but you can watch all the replays. There's 5 more live streams left in the Cram package. Plus there's Cram contest, which is underway. That's open for another few hours. We'll be closing that in a little less than 4 hours. So if you want to get on that in community. And as I mentioned, in the Fiveable community, if someone could post a link to that, that'd be super great. In the Fiveable community, we have some practice things available. I think if you just go to community.fiveable.me and then you kind of look for AP World practice prompts. So super great. Thank you for lots of really good questions. It was nice to meet some new people and hear your questions, and of course see some old friends. So stay in touch, everybody. The next free stream's Thursday night with Mr. Little, and I can't say enough about how good his streams are and the things he's done in the chat. And last Thursday's free replay, Mrs. Longnecker did an excellent job breaking down the big ideas for one of the time periods. So I would really take a look at that. Great. All right. See y'all soon.